there were sometimes those who made it clear they didn't much like teaching women. But this time, familiar surroundings felt strange, as though I were seeing them for the first time. Though I wasn't really sure from moment to moment if I was seeing more clearly or if everything looked somehow shadowy and vaguely sinister. Given the events of the day, it felt that the courtyard should be more crowded, more chaotic. But it was just as it always is toward the end of a day, with no particular religious obligations. A few folks praying, some talking with the priest, a low murmur of voices from all around, mostly having nothing to do with me or with him. I watched him for a long moment as he seemed to take in every stone, every arch, his face impassive, but for the tiniest flash of something in his eyes. Maybe grief, maybe love, maybe they're the same thing. I had just met him, although met might not be the right word for it. I'd heard about him. Certainly, who hadn't? He was the talk of all Judea, from what I could tell. And the stories that walked with the traders and the merchants, in those who had sought him out and come back, speaking of miracles, of one who teaches with authority, of arguments with teachers and priests and scribes. But this morning, there he was, in our town. The first we knew was a bit of commotion a couple houses down, as two strangers untied Shmuley's coat from the gate where he had left it, while his sons did some work in the stable. I poked my head out to see what all the fuss was about, and was astonished to see that the neighbors not only didn't stop the strangers, but followed them and the colt back down the road a ways, out of town. There was nothing in that moment to indicate who they were, or who was leading them, but it was hard not to notice him as we drew closer. He wasn't doing anything special, but still, so clearly, he was the beating heart of this group. And I found myself standing, watching, as they led the colt right to him, tossed their cloaks onto the colt like saddle blankets. He was really still too young an animal to ride. Somehow the way that the man treated that colt with such tenderness and reassurance, well, if I'd had any doubts that this was Jesus, they evaporated as I watched the love that just radiated from him, the way that he cared for this young animal, even as he mounted. But all that said, if I tell you that he looked ridiculous, oh, fully grown man sitting on a not fully grown colt, sitting on cloaks that had gathered the dust of the road, and he knew it. He knew exactly how silly he looked. He laughed at how his feet nearly dragged on the ground, and everyone laughed with him. Joyful, contagious laughter. Women started taking everyone's cloaks and spreading them in the road before him, bowing ostentatiously. Some of the younger men scaled the date palms to cut branches, while some of the older ones took the lower branches of evergreens and fruit trees, the ones that they could easily reach, and they covered the road ahead. One of my neighbors shouted out, "I bet the Roman governor looks pretty silly in comparison," and we all laughed, remembering that Pilate would be entering Jerusalem from the opposite side, riding a war horse, escorted by armed centurions, in what was usually a grand and glorious procession. The owner of the colt, old Shmuley, bowed deeply and cried, "Hail to the Son of David!" And soon we were all shouting with him, singing the words of the old psalm that suddenly made sense in a new way. And then we were walking. It seemed like the whole town of Bethany, singing and shouting, making sure the road was covered, gathering more people as we went, for the mockery of the occupying power that we all so despised, shouting louder and more stridently the further we went, as all of the pain of a long oppression, all of the insults of pretending Herod wasn't a puppet of Rome, all the desires of freedom found voice in us. This was the procession we wanted, heading toward the fast, the Passover, the remembrance of our own escape from oppression and slavery, all of the grief, all of the rage, all of the feelings that we had kept down for years poured into our shouts, our songs. This procession was the one that we deserved, the one that felt more and more as we drew closer to Jerusalem like it would restore the nation, renew the kingdom to the time of David. By the time we entered Jerusalem, it felt as though the power of God rode with us, as though we were bringing revolution in the form of a grown man on a colt. All he had to do was give the word, and we would have stormed the king's palace. We would have occupied the governor's compound. We would have declared our freedom. We would have followed him into a new life, into the life we all craved. But he did not lead us to the king. He did not lead us to the governor. We did not encounter the far more organized and beautiful procession happening across the city. He brought us to the temple, and at the temple gates we stopped, and the songs quieted, and the shouts gave way to silence, as we all looked between Jesus and the place to which he had brought us, the home of God on earth. And all of the rage, the grief, the pent-up emotion that had fueled us along the way from Bethany evaporated. We would have followed Jesus into the places we wanted to tear down and burn to the ground, but that is not where we ended up. One by one, the people turned back, picking up their cloaks, leaving the branches where they'd fallen, not making eye contact, as though denying the enormity of the emotional wave that had pulled us all in its wake. Jesus slipped off the colt, rubbed its neck and kissed its nose, and handed the lead back to Shmuley. If anyone else had come into the temple too, I didn't see them. I was really only looking at Jesus, who had showed us what we thought we wanted. It showed us the places that anger and grief will take us. The procession had been a mockery of Rome, absolutely. But it was also a mirror for us, a question about what drives us and what we will follow. Caught up in grief and rage and fear, we were one spark from violence. In the gathered emotion of the crowd, we would have burned the places that symbolized our oppression, eradicated the targets of our hatred. We were all too ready to have blood on our hands, blood that we could justify from violence that seemed liberative in that moment. Instead, we had come to the place of covenant, the place of faith, the location of the one whose love for us knows no bounds. And there, in that holy place, stood Jesus. The procession dissipated, even the disciples wandering off a bit. Jesus by himself gazing at this place of such profound holiness, and I wondered what he was thinking. Was he surprised by how easily we could be encouraged to rage? How deeply we believe that violence can bring about liberation? What did he want us to see? What did he want us to know about our faith, about ourselves, about what we might do in the frenzy of a mob, and what will we do, each of us, in the face of the divine? What happens to us when we act from love rather than rage or fear or hatred? He stood for a long moment, taking in the temple, then turning to look at the people, those just going about their daily lives, and those who had borne witness to their own human impulses laid bare in ways difficult to ignore. And then he turned, without a word, walking back the way that we had come, stepping over abandoned palms and forgotten garments, all the way to Bethany, and those who had joined the procession. The town was quiet, although all who were about glanced up as he came up the street. He paused often to say a quiet word to those who so soon before had been shouting out for salvation. On each face I watched shame turn into joy, fear into grace. the love that did not hold their anger against them, that returned to them, stayed with them, broke bread with them, loved them. Perhaps it is not, as we have long thought, by fighting against what we hate that we will win, but rather it will be in holding fast to what we love, for the sake of the one who first loved us, and whose love encompasses all the world. Thanks be to God. Amen.